The Galactic Survey Commission had been classifying worlds for 300 years. It was not glamorous work. It was thorough, systematic, scientifically rigorous work that produced a database of planetary assessments that the galactic community used for everything from trade route planning to colonial development to the basic navigational awareness of knowing what was out there and what it would do to you if you landed on it unprepared. 300 years of that work had produced classifications for over 40,000 worlds across the known systems. The lethality scale ran from 1 to 15. Class 1 was a world that would sustain unprotected life without significant risk. The kind of place where you could step off a shuttle and breathe and walk around and probably be fine. These were rare. Class 5 meant you needed equipment and protocols, but a prepared team could operate on the surface with manageable risk. Class 10 was the threshold above which the Commission's standard recommendation was automated survey only. The environment was hostile enough that putting living crew on the surface required a level of preparation and protective infrastructure that most organizations weren't going to invest in for a routine assessment. Class 15 was different in kind rather than degree. The Commission had assigned it 4 times. Not 4 times that year, not 4 times that decade. 4 times in the entire 300-year history of the organization. The classification existed in the rating system because the people who designed the rating system had been thorough enough to build a ceiling that accounted for the worst possible combination of factors, and periodically the galaxy produced a world that hit that ceiling. What happened to a Class 15 world was simple. The Commission filed the assessment in the restricted category, accessible to researchers and navigation authorities but not to commercial or colonial development offices. The world was noted as uninhabitable in every relevant database. A standard notation was added to any navigation chart that included the system. Hazard, do not approach without specialized authorization, no settlement application will be accepted. That last part was important. No settlement application will be accepted. It was not phrased as a recommendation. It was not phrased as a strong suggestion that the Commission would review on a case-by-case basis. It was the Commission's clearest possible way of saying, this conversation is closed. Nobody had ever tested that particular phrasing before KX-7. KX-7 was a mid-sized world in the Outer Survey Corridor, discovered during a routine expansion survey 18 months ago, assessed over a 4-month period by a Commission team using standard remote sensing and atmospheric drone protocols, and classified at the end of that assessment with a Class 15 rating that the lead assessor described in her notes as one of the cleaner Class 15 determinations she had ever seen. The factors were not marginal. They were comprehensive and mutually reinforcing in a way that produced a world where the atmospheric corrosivity alone would damage standard survey equipment within hours. The predator density in the temperate zones was among the highest on record for any assessed world. The geological instability produced seismic events across approximately 40% of the surface on a rotating basis, and the radiation levels in the upper equatorial regions exceeded safe exposure limits for most known species within minutes of unprotected surface presence. The Commission filed it. The restricted notation went into the navigation databases. The world was closed. 6 months later the application arrived. It came through the standard Colonial Development Review channel, the same channel through which hundreds of settlement applications were processed every year for worlds in the Class 1 through 8 range where colonial development was a normal and supported activity. The application was formatted correctly, included the required documentation, cited the correct regulatory framework, and requested review of World KX-7 for human settlement. The staff member who received it was a junior coordinator named Pete in the Commission's intake office. Pete had been processing applications for 3 years and he had a reliable sense of which ones were routine and which ones needed escalation. He looked at this one, looked up KX-7 in the database, looked at the Class 15 notation and the restricted filing and the no settlement application will be accepted language, and escalated it to his supervisor with a note that said he thought this might be a filing error. His supervisor looked at it and sent a polite correction notice to Humanity's Colonial Development Office explaining that KX-7 was a Class 15 restricted world and that the settlement application process was not applicable to worlds in this category and that if humanity was interested in colonial development opportunities there were many suitable worlds in the Class 1 through 8 range that the Commission would be happy to provide assessment data for. The response came back 48 hours later. It thanked the Commission for the clarification. It confirmed that Humanity's Colonial Development Office was aware of KX-7's Class 15 classification and had reviewed the Commission's assessment data in full before submitting the application. It confirmed that the application was not a filing error. It requested that the Commission proceed with the standard settlement review process as outlined in the Colonial Development Regulatory Framework. Pete's supervisor read the response twice. Then she walked it down the hall to her supervisor and said she was not sure what the correct next step was. Her supervisor read it. Then she sent it to the review board with a note that said, "I need guidance on this." The review board called an emergency meeting for the following Tuesday. The meeting invitation went out to all 12 board members with the standard emergency session designation and a brief description of the agenda item. Several board members responded asking for clarification on whether the agenda description was correct because the agenda description said Settlement Application Review for a Class 15 world, and that combination of words had not previously appeared in the same sentence in a commission document. The clarification confirmed the agenda description was correct. All 12 members attended on Tuesday. This was notable because full attendance at unscheduled emergency sessions was not common. Board members had significant competing responsibilities and typically at least 2 or 3 were unavailable for any given session regardless of priority level. All 12 came. They sat in the commission's review chamber and looked at the application and looked at each other, and the meeting opened with a question from the board chair that was not on any prepared agenda because there was no prepared agenda for this situation. She asked, "Has anyone looked at what humans actually know about KX-7 before submitting this?" Someone pulled the commission's own assessment data. Someone else pulled the publicly available research that humanity's scientific community had published on KX-7 since the commission's survey results had been released into the restricted database, which humanities research institutions apparently had access to, which was technically correct under the membership framework and which nobody had flagged as a concern until this moment. The humanity research was thorough. More thorough in several specific areas than the commission's own assessment. The board chair looked at it for a long time. Then she said, "They know exactly what they're applying for." The room was quiet. Not the quiet of people who had no idea what to do. The quiet of people who had a very good idea what to do within the existing framework and were realizing that the existing framework had been built without accounting for this specific input and that the gap between the framework and the situation was one that nobody in the room had previously needed to think about. The meeting ran for 4 hours. It did not produce a resolution. It produced a decision to send a joint survey team to KX-7 to conduct the documentation required for any settlement review, because the regulatory framework said that documentation was required and the regulatory framework did not have a provision for skipping it even in cases where the outcome seemed predetermined. Pete's supervisor, back in the intake office, processed the survey team authorization and filed the application as active pending assessment. It was the first time in 300 years that those words had appeared next to a Class 15 designation in the Commission's database. She looked at it for a moment after she filed it. Then she went and got some coffee because it had been that kind of day. The survey team assembled at Commission Station 7 over the course of 4 days. 5 species represented. 12 personnel total, the standard complement for a Class 15 assessment, which required more redundancy than lower-class surveys because the Commission's protocol for Class 15 environments was built on the assumption that equipment failure was a meaningful possibility and that redundancy was not optional. The vehicles were the Commission's sealed survey units, fully enclosed, atmosphere-independent, rated for environments up to and including Class 15 exposure on all external surfaces. The personnel suits were the Commission's highest protection rating, worn inside the vehicles as a secondary safeguard. The team lead was a senior survey officer named Dr. Riven of the Thessari delegation. He had been with the Commission for 19 years and had led assessments on 14 worlds across the class range, including 2 previous Class 14 surveys. He was thorough, experienced, and had a well-developed sense of what Class 15 protocol required and why it required it. He had reviewed the KX-7 assessment data before departure and had noted in his pre-mission log that the world's lethality factors were consistent and mutually reinforcing and that the team should expect a demanding operational environment. He had not noted anything about expecting to find humans already there because that had not been a thing he had considered possible. The transit to KX-7 took 11 days. The team used the time to review the Commission's assessment data, familiarize themselves with the specific lethality factors they would be documenting, and prepare the survey protocols that the settlement application review required. The documentation checklist for a Class 15 application review was extensive, more extensive than for any other category because the assumption embedded in the checklist was that every factor contributing to the Class 15 rating needed to be independently verified before any review board conclusion could be reached. Nobody on the team discussed what the conclusion was going to be because it was understood by everyone present. The documentation would confirm the classification. The classification would support denial of the application. The review board would deny the application. This was the expected sequence, and it was expected because it was the only sequence that the available information supported. The shuttle broke through KX-7's upper cloud layer at 0840 local time on the first survey day. KX-7's cloud layer was substantial, a thick, complex atmospheric structure that the Commission's assessment had characterized as producing persistent chemical precipitation across approximately 70% of the surface at any given time. The precipitation was corrosive. Not severely corrosive in the way of industrial chemical exposure, gradually corrosive in the way of a persistent environmental factor that degraded unprotected materials over extended exposure periods and had specific biological effects on the respiratory systems of most known species that ranged from irritating to dangerous depending on the species and the duration. The shuttle's external sensors activated as they descended through the cloud layer and began feeding data to the display screens in the cabin. Atmospheric composition. Precipitation analysis. Temperature and pressure gradients. External corrosivity index. The data was consistent with the Commission's pre-mission briefing in every category. KX-7 was exactly what the assessment said it was. Dr. Riven was reviewing the sensor feed from his command position when the visual display cleared below the cloud base and the surface became visible. He saw the human camp first. A collection of structures arranged in a deliberate configuration on a flat section of terrain near a geological feature the survey coordinates had flagged as a primary assessment point. Structured, organized, clearly occupied, power readings on the sensor feed confirmed active systems. He processed the camp for a moment. Then he saw the people outside it. 4 of them. Standing on the surface, moving around the area near the camp in the purposeful way of a team conducting fieldwork. They were wearing what the shuttle's optical sensors resolved as standard field research gear, the kind of equipment appropriate for a Class 5 or 6 environment at most. Not the atmospheric processing suits. Not anything approaching the protection rating that the Commission's protocol required for any surface exposure on a world rated above Class 10. The shuttle's atmospheric sensors were simultaneously registering an active precipitation event. The corrosivity index on the external feed was in the range that the Commission's protocol flagged as immediately hazardous to unprotected personnel. Dr. Riven looked at the sensor feed. He looked at the visual display. He looked at the sensor feed again. One of the 4 surface figures, a woman in a light jacket with a field kit on her back, holding what the optical sensors resolved as a sample collection container, looked up at the descending shuttle. She waved. A cheerful, uncomplicated wave. The wave of someone greeting an expected arrival on an ordinary workday. Dr. Riven processed this for a moment that was longer than most moments in his 19 years of commission work. Then he reached for the emergency welfare reporting system with his right hand and the atmospheric sensor confirmation function with his left hand because he needed both of those things done simultaneously and he only had 2 hands and they were both immediately occupied. The welfare report was a standard commission form for situations involving personnel in apparent distress or danger in a survey environment. He began filling it in. Under nature of concern he typed, 4 individuals observed on Class 15 surface in inadequate protective equipment during active corrosive precipitation event. He looked up from the form. The woman was still standing there. She had gone back to her sample container. She was crouching now, examining something in the soil with the focused attention of someone who had found something interesting and was taking the time to document it properly. She did not appear to be in distress. Dr. Riven completed the atmospheric sensor confirmation. The confirmation confirmed. The data was accurate. The precipitation currently falling on the surface of KX-7 was what the sensor said it was and the corrosivity index was what the sensor said it was and the 4 humans standing in it were wearing what the optical sensors said they were wearing. The shuttle landed in the designated survey zone. The landing process required the standard pre-egress protocol sequence: atmosphere checks, suit integrity verification, vehicle seal confirmation. It took 11 minutes. Dr. Riven completed all of it with his usual thoroughness while through the forward viewport the human team continued their fieldwork without any visible modification to what they were doing. The welfare report had been transmitted to the Commission relay station during descent. The automated acknowledgement came back as the egress sequence completed. Dr. Riven noted that the acknowledgement did not contain any information about what he was supposed to do next because the welfare report system had not been designed for a situation where the personnel it was reporting on appeared to be completely unaffected by the thing they were being reported about. The survey team's ORESI representative, a methodical and experienced field scientist named Coordinator Vel who had been watching the surface through the viewport throughout the landing sequence, said in a voice that was making a genuine effort to stay professionally neutral, that the humans appeared to have been here for some time. Dr. Riven confirmed this. The camp structures were not newly erected. The equipment around the site showed the weathering patterns of extended surface exposure. The activity pattern of the team was the activity pattern of people who had been in a location long enough to have established routines. He looked at the welfare report acknowledgement on his screen. Then he looked at the woman with the sample container who was now standing up and walking toward the survey shuttle with the relaxed and direct purpose of someone coming to meet colleagues who had arrived for a scheduled visit. He noted, for the record, that she was walking through the precipitation without any visible modification to her pace or posture. Without any visible discomfort. Without any visible awareness that the atmospheric sensors of every piece of equipment on the survey shuttle were registering the environment she was walking through as immediately hazardous to unprotected personnel. She reached the shuttle's external communication panel and activated it. Her voice came through clearly. She said, "Dr. K. Webb, Human Advanced Assessment Team. Welcome to KX-7. We've got 6 weeks of data if you want to start with the full briefing, or I can show you the site first. Either works." Dr. Riven looked at his team. His team looked at him. Coordinator Vel said, still in the professionally neutral voice, that perhaps they should start with the briefing. Dr. Riven agreed that perhaps they should. He filed an addendum to the welfare report noting that the personnel in question appeared functional and unharmed and that he was updating the report status to monitoring pending further assessment because none of the available form options covered the situation accurately and monitoring pending further assessment was the closest available approximation. Then he opened the external communication panel and told Dr. Webb that the briefing sounded like a good place to start. Dr. Webb led them to the briefing structure at the center of the camp. It was a standard human field research setup. Modular panels assembled into a working space with equipment along 2 walls, a central table with a display surface, storage organized with the practical efficiency of people who had been living and working out of a field camp long enough to have optimized every square meter of it. The structure itself was weathered on the exterior in the way of materials that had been sitting in KX-7's atmosphere for 6 weeks. The interior was clean and functional and smelled like coffee, which was not something Dr. Riven had expected KX-7 to smell like and which produced a specific cognitive dissonance that he noted and set aside. 3 other members of the Human Advance team were in the briefing structure when they arrived. They acknowledged the survey team with the relaxed and professional ease of people who were comfortable in their environment and had been expecting visitors. One of them, a younger man named Field Researcher Tom who appeared to be the team's data coordinator, pulled up the assessment files on the central display and started organizing them for the briefing without being asked. Dr. Webb stood at the display and looked at the survey team arranged around the table and asked where they wanted to start. Dr. Riven said start at the beginning. He said it in the tone of someone who meant it literally. So she started at the beginning. The atmospheric corrosivity factor had been the first priority in week 1 because it was the most immediately relevant to the team's ability to function on the surface. The Commission's assessment had rated KX-7's atmospheric chemistry as corrosive to biological respiratory tissue across all known species categories and had flagged it as an immediate exposure hazard. This was accurate. The atmosphere as it existed in an unmodified state was exactly as described. The human team had not left it unmodified. Dr. Webb pulled up the Week 2 documentation. The team's atmospheric chemist, she introduced her by name, Dr. Lisa, who was currently outside running soil tests, had identified in the first week that the corrosivity was not a fixed property of the atmosphere but a product of a specific chemical interaction between 2 compounds that were present in the upper air layer. Addressing one of those compounds addressed the interaction. The mineral compounds available in the local geology included several that reacted with the relevant atmospheric chemical in a way that neutralized it. Week 2 had produced a filter protocol using locally sourced mineral material that could be incorporated into standard field equipment and that reduced the effective atmospheric corrosivity to a level within normal human operational tolerance. She showed them the testing data. 6 weeks of atmospheric exposure records for each team member, cross-referenced with the filter protocol implementation date. The pre-protocol data confirmed the Commission's assessment. The atmosphere was corrosive to biological tissue and the initial exposure readings showed the effects the assessment had predicted. The post-protocol data showed those readings dropping to within normal parameters within 48 hours of implementation and staying there. The Commission survey team read the testing data. Nobody said anything. Dr. Webb moved to the predator activity mapping. KX-7's predator density had been one of the most significant contributors to the Class 15 rating. The Commission survey drones had recorded activity levels in the temperate zones that were among the highest in the database for any assessed world. The rating was accurate. The predator density was real. What the Commission's drone survey had not produced because it had not been designed to produce it and because a 4-month remote assessment did not generate the kind of longitudinal behavioral data that 6 weeks of on-ground observation did, was a complete activity pattern map. The human team had produced one. Tom pulled up the activity mapping display. 6 weeks of movement tracking across the survey zone, broken down by time of day, weather condition, temperature range, and seasonal position. The patterns that emerged from 6 weeks of data were clear. The predator activity in the temperate zones was high, but it was not random. It had structure. Predictable peaks, predictable troughs, predictable spatial distributions that varied with the time of day and the precipitation status of the local atmosphere. The safe movement zones were the spaces where the activity trough patterns overlapped with the terrain features that predators used least frequently. The safe hours were the windows within the trough cycles where movement through those zones produced the lowest probability of encounter. The team had mapped both and had been using the resulting protocol for 4 weeks. Dr. Riven looked at the mapping display for a long time. He had a significant background in survey assessment and he understood activity pattern mapping and he could read what the display was showing. The methodology was sound. The data was comprehensive. The conclusions drawn from it were supported by the evidence. He asked how many predator encounters the team had experienced during the 4 weeks they had been using the safe movement protocol. Dr. Webb said 3. All in the early implementation phase before the protocol had been fully refined. No physical contact in any of the 3. The protocol had been adjusted after each encounter and had been producing clean results for the past 3 weeks. She moved to the soil assessment. The Commission's rating had flagged KX7's surface soil layer as hostile to most forms of cultivation due to the acidic chemistry produced by the atmospheric precipitation accumulating in the top layer over geological time. This was accurate as a description of the surface layer. Dr. Webb pulled up the soil core data the team's geologist had taken across 12 sites in the survey zone. The surface layer was acidic as documented. The subsurface layer, beginning at approximately 40 centimeters depth, was a different composition entirely. A mineral-rich substrate with a chemistry that the team's agricultural specialist had assessed as highly fertile. 3 test cultivation plots. Established in week 3. Growing currently. Tom pulled up the plot photographs on the display. Green, active, healthy growth and clearly tended plots on the surface of what the Commission had classified as a definitively uninhabitable world. The survey team looked at the photographs. Dr. Webb walked through the seismic data next. The Commission's assessment had flagged geological instability across approximately 40% of the surface. The team's geologist had spent the first 10 days of the survey producing a detailed seismic mapping of the survey zone and the surrounding region. The instability was real and the 40% figure was accurate as a global average. What the global average did not convey was the distribution. The seismically active zones were not randomly distributed. They followed the underlying geological fault structure, which the mapping had characterized in sufficient detail to identify the stable zones with high confidence. The stable zones represented approximately 60% of the temperate region surface area and included terrain suitable for the kind of permanent infrastructure that a settlement would require. Dr. Webb stopped talking. The display was showing all 6 weeks of documentation simultaneously: the atmospheric data, the predator mapping, the soil cores, the seismic survey, the test plot photographs, the equipment logs, the daily operational records. The complete picture of what 12 humans had done with a Class 15 Deathworld in 6 weeks of field work. The Commission survey team was quiet. Dr. Riven was reading the display in the focused way of a senior assessor reviewing data, systematically checking the methodology, cross-referencing the conclusions against the supporting evidence. The data held up. He had been checking it as Dr. Webb presented it and it held up at every point. The solutions documented were real solutions. The testing was real testing. The results were what the data said they were. Coordinator Vel had been quiet since the predator mapping section. The Oresi representative was known among the team for maintaining a thorough and analytical composure in field assessment situations. He was quiet in a different way now. Not the composure of analysis but the quiet of someone who had encountered a gap between their model of a situation and the actual situation and was sitting in that gap. He looked at Dr. Webb. He asked, in the careful and precise way of someone who wanted to make sure the answer was what they thought it was going to be, whether the advanced team had experienced any casualties or significant medical events during the 6 weeks on KX7's surface. Dr. Webb said 2 sprained ankles, one in week 1 from uneven terrain before the movement protocols were fully established, one in week 4 from a minor misjudgment during the seismic survey fieldwork. And 1 team member had had an allergic reaction to contact with a local plant species in week 3. The reaction had been treated with standard field medical supplies and resolved within 48 hours. She paused. She added that the team had also had a brief equipment issue with one of the atmospheric filter units in week 2, but that the redundant unit had covered the gap without incident and the primary unit had been repaired within 6 hours. Coordinator Vel was quiet for a moment. Then, without particularly meaning to in the way of someone whose legs have made a decision independently of their professional composure, he sat down on the vehicle step that was the closest available surface. 2 sprained ankles. An allergen. An equipment issue that had been resolved in 6 hours. 6 weeks on a Class 15 world. Dr. Riven was still looking at the display. He was going to need to file a report. The report was going to be accurate and thorough, and it was going to describe what the human team had documented and verify it against the Commission's own instruments, and it was going to produce a conclusion that the review board was going to find very difficult to work with. He was already thinking about how to write it in a way that was accurate and also conveyed the experience of sitting in this briefing structure on the surface of a Class 15 world looking at test plots growing in the subsurface soil of a world that was not supposed to be able to grow anything. He did not yet have the right phrasing. He kept looking at the display and worked on finding it. Dr. Riven's report took 9 days to write. Not because he was slow. Because he was thorough, and because the report needed to be thorough in a way that was different from the thoroughness of a standard survey report. A standard survey report documented findings against an expected framework, and its thoroughness was in the completeness of the documentation. This report was documenting findings that did not fit the framework, and its thoroughness needed to account for that gap. Not to explain it away, but to represent it accurately so that the review board received an honest picture of what the survey team had found. He filed it on a Thursday. It was 47 pages including appendices. The executive summary at the front was 2 pages, and it said, in the careful and precise language of a 19-year commission professional, that the Human Advance Team's 6-week assessment of KX-7 was technically accurate, methodologically sound, and had been independently verified against commission instruments across all documented factors. It said that the solutions proposed for each Class 15 lethality factor were viable and had been tested and shown to produce the results claimed. It said that the survey team had found no technical basis on which to recommend denial of the settlement application. It did not say how he felt about writing that sentence. That was personal information, and it stayed out of the report. The review board met the following Tuesday. All 12 members again. Same full attendance as the first emergency meeting, which at this point was becoming a pattern that the scheduling coordinator noted in the session log with the same careful neutrality she applied to everything. The board chair opened by confirming that every member had received and reviewed both Dr. Riven's survey report and Dr. Webb's original 6-week assessment and the Commission's own instrument verification data. Confirmation went around the table. Then she asked for initial assessments. The first 3 members who spoke all arrived at the same place from different directions. Member 1 said the technical verification was unambiguous and the board had no legitimate basis for denial under the existing regulatory framework. Member 2 said the same thing in different words. Member 3 said she had reviewed the regulatory framework specifically looking for a provision that could support denial and had not found one. The framework required a technical basis for denial, and the technical basis for denial was not there. The board's legal advisor confirmed this. The regulatory framework was clear. The settlement application process required the Commission to evaluate applications on their technical merits. The technical merits of the KX-7 application, as documented by the survey report, supported approval. The Class 15 classification was a rating, not a legal barrier. The language in the database notation, "No settlement application will be accepted," had been written as a practical statement about expected reality rather than as a binding regulatory provision, and it had never been tested because the situation it was being tested against had never come up before. The room was quiet for a moment with this. Board Member 4, a senior assessor named Dr. Holt, who had been with the Commission for 26 years and who had a reputation for asking the questions that other people were working around, asked the thing that the first 3 members had been working around. He asked whether the board was actually considering approving a settlement application for a Class 15 world, or whether they were looking for a way to deny it that was technically justifiable and had simply not found one yet. The distinction mattered. The first was a decision. The second was a process looking for a predetermined conclusion, and the board's role was not to produce predetermined conclusions. Nobody answered directly. The silence was its own answer. The board chair said she wanted to approach the question differently. She said the regulatory framework question was clear and Member 3's analysis was correct, and the board was going to have to reckon with that. But before they got to the decision, she wanted to understand something that the survey report documented but did not explain. She said, how did they do this? Not the specific technical solutions which were in the report. How does a species produce a team that goes to a Class 15 world and in 6 weeks turns it into a field camp with test plots growing in the soil? The room did not have an answer for this. Board Member 7, a xenobiologist named Dr. Price, who had joined the commission 12 years ago from the academic research track and who brought a different kind of analytical perspective to the board than the survey professionals, said that the answer probably started with where humans came from and what that had made them. The board chair looked at her. Dr. Price said she had been thinking about this since she read the survey report, and she had a question for the board. She asked whether anyone had looked at what the Commission's own instruments had rated Earth during humanity's original contact assessment 60 years ago. The room was quiet. The answer was no. Nobody had looked. The contact assessment for Earth was 60 years old and had been processed through the standard First Contact Protocol and filed in the Historical Archive, and nobody had had a reason to go looking at it in the context of the current situation. Dr. Price asked the board's research coordinator to pull it. The research coordinator, a young staff member named Rob, who was attending his first board session as the new coordinator and who was having a considerably more eventful first session than he had anticipated, pulled up the historical archive on the room's central display and located the Earth contact assessment. He opened the file. He found the planetary rating. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at the board chair and said the file was on the display. The board chair looked at the display. Then the rest of the board looked at the display. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when several people are reading the same thing at the same time, and the thing they are reading is causing each of them to independently arrive at the same understanding, and the understanding is significant enough that nobody wants to be the first one to say it out loud. Earth had been rated Class 11. Not Class 4, which was where most of the Coalition's member species' homeworlds fell. Not Class 6 or 7, which was the upper range for worlds that produced spacefaring civilizations in the standard developmental models. Class 11. A world with predator systems, geological activity, atmospheric variability, biological hazard density, and a dozen other measured lethality factors that had placed it 4 steps below KX-7 on the Commission's own scale. And humanity had not just survived it. They had covered every square kilometer of it. They had built civilizations on it. They had treated its oceans and its mountains and its weather systems and its predators as the background conditions of daily life, and had developed and thrived in a way that had eventually produced jump capability and a coalition membership application, and now a settlement application for a world that the Commission had classified as definitively incompatible with organized habitation. Dr. Holt was looking at the Earth file on the display with the expression of someone whose model of a situation has just been substantially revised and who is now running everything he thought he understood about the current problem through the new model. He said, "They didn't come to KX-7 in spite of the Class 15 rating." He said it quietly. Not to the room specifically. More like something he was saying out loud, because saying it out loud was how he confirmed it was actually what he was thinking. Dr. Price said, "No. They came to it because of what they are. And what they are is what a Class 11 world produces when the species on it decides to figure out how to handle everything it throws at them instead of being stopped by it." The room was quiet again. The board chair looked at the Earth file. She looked at Dr. Riven's survey report. She looked at the photograph in the appendix of Dr. Webb's test plots growing in KX-7 soil. She asked the legal advisor how long the approval paperwork would take to process. The legal advisor said 3 weeks for a standard approval. She said she could expedite it to 10 days if the board wanted to treat it as priority processing. The board chair said to treat it as priority processing. She looked at Rob, the research coordinator, and asked him to make sure the Earth contact assessment was flagged in the current case file as relevant background documentation. Rob said he would do that. He made a note. Then he looked at the Earth rating on the display again briefly and made another note that was not for the official file. A personal note that he would look at later when he was trying to make sense of what he had just witnessed in his first board session. It said simply, Class 11. They're from a Class 11 world. Of course they applied for KX-7. The Earth contact assessment file was 60 years old and had not been opened in 43 of those years. It was in the Historical Archive section of the Commission's database, the section that housed the original assessment records from first contact proceedings, organized by species and date. These files were not secret. They were not restricted. They were simply old, and old files in large institutional databases accumulated a particular quality of invisibility that had nothing to do with access control and everything to do with the fact that nobody had a current reason to look at them. Rob, the research coordinator, had pulled it up in under 2 minutes. The file was complete and well preserved. The Commission's archival standards were thorough and the documentation from 60 years ago was as readable and detailed as anything filed last week. The original assessment team had done their job carefully and the record reflected that. The planetary rating was on the second page of the executive summary. Class 11. The board had been looking at it for about 40 seconds when the quality of the room changed. Not dramatically, nobody stood up, nobody said anything, nothing happened that would have been visible to someone watching from outside the room. But something shifted in the collective attention of 12 experienced professionals sitting around a table, and the shift was the specific one that happened when a group of people who were individually smart arrived at the same understanding simultaneously and each of them recognized that the others had arrived there too. The board chair read the file from the beginning. Not the executive summary, the full assessment. She read the predator density section, which documented Earth's ecological history in the systematic way of a commission assessment and which produced a picture of a planet where the food chain had been violent and complex and where the species that had eventually developed cognitive dominance had done so in an environment that was actively trying to produce outcomes unfavorable to their survival at every stage of the process. She read the geological activity section. Earth's tectonic history, volcanic activity, climate variability over geological time. A planet that had experienced mass extinction events, that had shifted from ice ages to warm periods and back, that was still producing significant seismic and volcanic activity in its current state. The kind of geological profile that the Commission's framework associated with environments that challenged the development of stable long-term civilization. She read the atmospheric variability section. The biological hazard density section. The pathogen environment section. This one was particularly detailed because Earth's biological ecosystem had produced pathogens in variety and lethality that placed it well above the average for inhabited worlds in the Commission's database. Class 11 was not a marginal rating. It was not a borderline assessment where a few factors had pushed a Class 9 world over a threshold. It was a comprehensive rating supported by multiple independent high-scoring factors that had combined to produce a number that the Commission's scale placed 4 steps below the maximum lethality designation. Dr. Holt had been reading the same file in parallel on his personal display. He got to the end of the biological hazard section and leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way of someone who has just finished processing something that required a significant amount of processing. He said, "They domesticated Class 11. That's what they did. Over 10,000 years of recorded history and however long before that. They took a Class 11 world and they learned every system on it and they figured out how to live in it and work with it until it wasn't a threat environment anymore. It was just home." Nobody disagreed with this. Dr. Price, the xenobiologist who had suggested pulling the Earth file, was making notes on her personal display. Not for the official record. Working notes, the kind she made when she was building a framework for understanding something. She had been making them since the survey report landed on her desk and they had been getting longer and more detailed as the picture clarified. She said that the Commission's classification system was designed to answer a specific question. The question was, how dangerous is this world to an average spacefaring species? The system answered that question accurately and the Class 15 rating for KX-7 was an accurate answer to that question for an average spacefaring species. She said the system was not designed to answer the question of how dangerous a given world was to a species that had developed on a Class 11 world and had spent its entire history treating environmental lethality as a set of problems to be solved rather than a set of barriers to be accepted. She said those were different questions and the Commission had only ever needed to ask the first one before now. Board Member 6, a quiet and methodical assessor named Dr. Green who had said very little across both board sessions, looked up from his own notes and said that the implication of Dr. Price's point was that the Commission's entire approach to evaluating human settlement applications might need to be reconsidered. Not just KX-7. The framework assumption that Class 15 was a deterrent was based on how the classification scale related to species capability in general. If human capability did not relate to the classification scale the same way other species' capabilities did, then the framework was producing incorrect outputs when applied to human applications specifically. The board chair said that was a conversation for a different session and a working group that she was going to convene and that Dr. Green and Dr. Price were both on it. She looked around the table. She said the current session needed to produce a decision on the KX-7 application. She said the legal framework was clear and 3 members had confirmed it independently and the survey report supported approval and the board's role was to make decisions based on the evidence in front of them. She asked for the vote. The vote was 12-0. The approval paperwork went to the Commission's administrative office the same afternoon. The processing coordinator who received it, A senior administrator named Ben, who had been with the Commission for 18 years and who had processed hundreds of settlement approvals, looked at the world designation on the form and pulled up the database entry to confirm the details and sat with the Class 15 notation on his screen for a moment before he started the processing sequence. He processed it correctly and completely. The approval was filed. The restricted notation in the navigation database was updated to reflect the approved settlement status. The reclassification paperwork was generated for the Commission's Classification Committee to review at their next scheduled session. Ben completed the processing and moved on to the next item in his queue. Then he went back to the KX7 file because something was sitting with him that he needed to deal with before he could fully move on. He was a methodical person and he believed in accurate and complete record-keeping, and the human species file in the Commission's member database had a gap in it that the events of the past several weeks had made visible. The gap was that the file documented humanity's coalition membership application and their developmental history and their various interactions with Commission processes, but it did not contain any notation that reflected what had just happened. What it actually meant in practical terms: that humanity was the kind of species that applied to settle Class 15 worlds and sent advanced teams who treated corrosive precipitation as a filter engineering problem and predator density as an activity mapping exercise. That was information the Commission needed in its records. Future staff would encounter humanity's applications and interactions, and they would be better equipped to process them accurately if the file reflected the relevant context. Ben thought about how to write it for several minutes. He was not a person who wrote things carelessly, and he wanted the notation to be accurate. He wrote, "Species developmental context. Originated on a world independently assessed at Class 11 lethality. Civilizational history consistent with treating high lethality environmental factors as engineering and adaptation challenges. Commission classification scale may not function as a deterrent for settlement applications from this species in the same manner as for species originating from lower-class environments." He read it back. It was accurate. It was complete. It was going to be useful to future staff. He added one more line because accuracy required it and because the KX7 case had made it clearly evidenced rather than speculative. He wrote, "Based on available case evidence, high lethality classifications appear to function as motivation rather than deterrent for this species. Recommend against using Deathworld classification language in application denial communications." He filed the notation and closed the file. In the outer survey corridor, KX7 was already receiving the first supply shipment that Dr. Webb's advanced team had requested 3 weeks ago. Standard colonial development materials, construction supplies, agricultural equipment, the infrastructure components that turned a field camp into the beginning of something permanent. Dr. Webb signed for the delivery from the surface, standing in the light precipitation of a KX7 morning, and sent a brief acknowledgement to the Colonial Development Office saying the supplies had arrived and the team was ready to begin the next phase. The Colonial Development Office filed the acknowledgement. Somewhere in the Commission's database a new file was opening. The KX7 settlement record. First entries dated. First documentation filed. The first human settlement on a Class 15 world. Not despite what the world was. Because of what the humans were. The file kept growing from there.